I know some foreigners and local Kenyan young scholars want to know what sort of development went into Makueni and how you did it yourself. I would like to ask Professor Peter Kagwanja to come and tell us something about the Look East foreign policy under the Kibaki administration. Professor Kagwanja actually is the youngest of all these scholars you see here, but that's why he's the most active. And he was a graduate student when I knew him at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the US, before coming to work in South Africa, then eventually to come to work for the government here, including the party, the Democratic Party. So Professor Kagwanja, and please don't exceed.
I'll keep time.
You're a diplomat, I know you. Please.
Excellency, Mheshimiwa Kalonzo Musyoka, our former Vice President, our former Deputy President, Mheshimiwa Rigathi Gachagua, my friend, former Minister, my in-law, I must say that, my brother-in-law, Eugene Wamalwa, our patron, former Minister Munyao, our chairman, our distinguished friend and mentor in many ways, Mheshimiwa Francis Mudhaura, and others. I think I was to start with a statement that kind of prefaces the whole of this meeting, which is that Kenya is a resilient nation. We are a resilient people. We shall surely rise like that proverbial phoenix from the ashes and rise again. Because one of us, as President Mwai Kibaki did, will rise up, be a man of integrity, be a man of Solomonic wisdom, be a man of untold patience, and guide us through the thick and bring us to the right. That man will always rise in this country. For centuries to come, Kenya will go through difficulties, but somehow God will always bring another Kibaki to look after us. I think that's the message of hope we want to share today, so that we should not give up, we should not get angry. It is going to be the cycles of our lives. I was not associated with President Mwai Kibaki as one of his cabinet ministers, as Professor Chega said. I didn't get there. What I did is that when he visited South Africa in 2004, his first state visit, I was one of the team that welcomed him with Ambassador Tabitha Sei and others. And we had a moment of talking. And somehow, when he came back, I was appointed to head the team that drafted Kenya's first ever foreign policy document, which now become our foreign policy accepted in 2014 by the cabinet, and which was revised this year. I also headed his team that established Kenya's foreign policy institute, and today called Academy, whose aim was to ensure that Kenyans understand that our foreign policy is family rooted in our national interests. Third, in 2007, I was asked to join his technical strategy team for his re-election campaign. Very challenging time for us who lived that time. Four, I headed his technical team in the negotiation for the 2010 Constitution, internal negotiations with the opposition that time, which was already in the government. And he appointed me as his executive director to head the referendum, both as a strategist and also as a manager of the campaign. And we did well, and he was happy with that. We got 70%, and we got a new constitution. And finally, I was asked to help advise on the transition from 2010 to 2013. A very difficult task for anybody extremely difficult because democracies have difficulties transiting or having peaceful transitions. But somehow he managed to have one of the most peaceful transitions from himself to President Uhuru Kenyatta. And the country has continued from that stability. So I was privileged as a scholar to be in the back rooms and to give my intellectual feedbacks. I think when I first met Ambassador Mudhaura in my first ever meeting with him, he told me, Professor, we know what we are doing. We meet every day and make decisions. So don't come here and tell us what to do. Tell us what we are doing wrong. A very difficult task, because how can you tell what is going wrong if you are not part of what's going on? So, but we made it, and it was a challenging time, but we made it. I remember at a certain stage, I worked very closely with Vice President Kalonzo Musyoka in many ways. And when he left for COD, I think I followed him at that time. Now, I want to zero my remarks very quickly on his foreign policy, and I won't go to the details of it. But I want to spell out the principles that guided Kibaki's foreign policy. First, Kibaki ideologically believed that we need a developmental state, because he disagreed with the World Bank and the IMF that we need to have a lean, non-interventionist state. For Kibaki, the state is important in steering development and also pulling people out of poverty. So the state is important. And he, in that light, was identifying with the young tigers in Eastern Asia, which had already managed to pull themselves from poverty and to bring about development. And that was the main linchpin of his foreign policy, that our foreign policy is developmental, and everywhere it goes, it has to be developmental. Second, Kibaki created a foreign policy that was driven by knowledge. Not only knowledge of ourselves, which was based in Vision 2030, but a knowledge of other nations and what they mean to us. Not what they mean to themselves and to others, but what they mean to us. And I'm going to explain that further. And therefore, in this foreign policy, which is based on knowledge, we need men and women of knowledge. We need to put our best and ablest in public offices, in foreign missions, as envoys, and that is the only way we can succeed. He believed strongly in the idea of meritocracy in our diplomacy. Without meritocracy, without having our best out there, those with the technical knowledge, those with scientific knowledge, we cannot go far. Third, President Kibaki based our foreign policy on our national interest, not on what he believed in, not on what those in his government believed in, but what we knew as our foreign policy. I know he asked the National Security Council to define clearly what our national interests are. I teach at the National Defense University, and anytime, because that's the course I teach, I always go through them without change because they are cast in concrete. Top of those is our development, our national economic development. The fourth and the final pillar is a foreign policy propelled by 1, Kenyan nationalism, 2, Pan-Africanism, and 3, principles of humanism internationally, that all human beings are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights and powers as well. And therefore, the foreign policy is subordinated to the interest of our people. It cannot serve individual interest. And what did he do about the orientation of this foreign policy? I know Professor Chege has talked about Kibaki Rook East policy. No, Kibaki's policy was neither Rook East nor Rook West. It had 4 aspects to it. 1, it was African-centered. Kenya is an African state. We are guided, Pan-Africanism is our ideology, and our interest of Africa come first before any other interest. And therefore, we are Afrocentric in our orientation. Second, we look west. Listen, we look west. He said we cannot abandon traditional relationship with the West. But what we need to do is to subordinate those relationships with the West to our national interest. And therefore, in addition to our embassy in London, he decided that we are going to open a new embassy in Dublin. And people are asking, why do we have to have two embassies? Because Dublin was the European capital of IT. This is where the technology was at that time really flourishing. Without that move, I'm not sure we would have made M-Pesa. Because Kibaki knew that we need to deepen ourselves in Dublin and the European technological movement so that we become a technological nation. And that's why Kenya is the leading African nation in technology. There's no other move. He also decided that we are going to Madrid, Spain. Whereas Madrid was never, Spain was never a colonizer in Africa. Why? Because Spain is a source of our technology, it's also a source of tourists who want to come to Africa, and many other aspects that were coming in. So that is what we are calling relooking the West, not abandoning the West, but looking deeper into the West from the prism of our national interest. Third, we look east. And by east, he did not define it as China. He said we look at the whole east, including Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. But more primarily to China. Why? Because these are emerging economic powerhouses. And they had deep resources that we could tap to finance our development, particularly our infrastructure. I was part of the delegation of the government to New York, I think around 2006, when we wanted to refurbish our railway, to build a new railway. And that proposal was put before the World Bank by President Kibaki's team. It was rejected, and they said, refurbish the old railway, privatize it, and then all will be given unto you. After doing that, the railway essentially grounded to a halt, and 95% of our cargo had to move by road. And the consequences are familiar to us. So President Kibaki went to China with a very singular issue. We need to open our infrastructure, our roads, our railways, our ports, and all the arteries of our economy. That was what Look East policy was like. But Kibaki did not just look east. Finally, he looked south. And looking south here meant that we went to Brazil, and there we got our airlines, the Embla and others. So we looked elsewhere. So those are the four orientations of Kibaki's legacy. And in conclusion, let me say this. In line with President Kibaki's legacy, in decades and centuries to come, Kenya will have its raw moments. But one of us will rise and will lift us from that rawness and bring us to greatness, bring us to prosperity, bring us to self-pride as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kagwanja. You kept within time. Honorable Norman Nyaga, my kid brother, welcome. I would like to welcome a distinguished gentleman, President Kibaki's Minister for Trade and Industry, a distinguished career which began as my student, I must say, one of those distinguished students I've ever taught. I think he taught me more than I taught him. And in politics, and very dedicated man to the welfare of our country. And professionally so competent, the world had to listen to him as Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, first Kenyan, to my knowledge, to head a specialized agency of the United Nations and do it so competently as well.
The family of the late President Kibaki, Your Excellencies, party leaders, you have all been recognized. The only ones who have not been recognized individually are our flavor of the month, Justin Muturi, my whip when I was a minister under Kibaki, Norman Yaga. Ladies and gentlemen, for purposes of turning this into a conversation involving all of you, I will keep within the time limit, but also say things that others have not said. Quite a bit of what I wanted to say has been said, particularly by Professor Kagwanja, aligning national, international, and domestic policy with identified national priorities. But if you may allow me, I want to reminisce, not in a way of remembering what Kibaki did, but in raising our collective challenge of the moment in the light of how Kibaki dealt with it. And for this, I think I start with a sound reading of the situation. I start with the earliest time I had intense interaction with the late president was around the year 2000, when we were trying to build a coalition of the opposition. And what he was exuding of as a leader was being so comfortable in your own standing that you don't try too hard to impose yourself as the leader. That through the period when we were bonding, it was very difficult. There were real spoilers, and normally you were present. You could hear Martin Shikuku go off about you Kikuyus and what you have done to us. And Matu Amai reply with how much we have the money and we have the people, will just remember and sympathize with you. But Kibaki had to rein in all these extremes and accommodate without overemphasizing his role as the leader. But to me, this also indicated an underlying strength that Kibaki had, and it ran through his leadership. He was clever enough to know that he was not adequate in everything. I never know clever people think they know everything. When you find such people, they're not clever. Yeah. And being adequately clever meant that he tried to identify talent that he could nurture, but he could also assign responsibilities to persons that he thought could perform. But to me, the most important evidence of his sense of clever enough to feel inadequate was the importance he placed on the creation of a National Economic and Social Council. I think one of the most important features that really set up the beacons for the Kibaki presidency was to say, if you are sailing without a rudder, you can end up where you came from instead of the right destination. And you cannot overstate the importance of the National Economic and Social Council and one of its products, Vision 2030, in aligning immediate political priorities with long-term identified national agenda that is depersonalized, that is not a Kibaki agenda, but an agenda for Kenya. Secondly, the humility of Kibaki surprised many of us when we were building the early phase of the government. Like many of you can remember, within the very first cabinet meeting I think we had, President Kibaki introduced to cabinet a proposal that we donate Cabernet Gardens to Daniel Arap Moi. At that time, some ministers were telling Kano people, you sit back, you didn't know how to rule, you should have to rule, you are thieves. But here's a president who has been humiliated by Moi for years, saying, let us get out of the way a sense that you can be vindictive. Let us be larger than the conduct and behavior of those from whom we are taking power. Can we have the strength to say, we retire you with respect and donate to you a public asset you did not steal for all the years you were president? I want to finish off with a bit about humility, because recently I listened to something and I said, can you imagine President Kibaki saying, don't you know I am the president? You know, when you are not adequate in yourself that you are holding an office, you look for external assurances that you are actually the boss that you're holding that office. But Kibaki was too big for that kind of pettiness. And every time I hear anybody say, do you know I am what? I miss my Kibaki. Now, when Kibaki appointed me minister, there are 2-3 areas that were immediately challenging and important to us. With the Right Honorable Stephen Kalonzo Musyoka, we were members of Council of East African Community and were in the final phase of negotiating a customs union for East Africa, which we did around Christmas 2005. The challenges we had were the contrasting national interests of Tanzania and Kenya, and Tanzania and Uganda, and Kenya and Uganda. For example, Tanzanians consume much more wheat in chapati than anybody else in East Africa in per capita terms. And therefore, as a country without production of any significant quantities of wheat, Tanzania will always want the cheapest, the lowest duty on wheat because of the chapati interest. Now, Kenya has some wheat farmers, like Ethiopia and a few other places, not sufficient for our national interest, but requiring some protection from cheap wheat brought in under a low tariff on wheat products. And there we were, stuck in discussions with Tanzania, and we'll come back to Mike Kibaki and he says, lazima tuonyeshe interest kwamba tunataka huu umoja wetu, it is important to us, but don't sacrifice Kenyan farmers for that umoja. Similarly, we had a challenge with Uganda. The state in Uganda was dominated by mercantilist capitalists, importers of low-cost merchandise from Eastern Asia, and trying to quickly turn a profit. But Kenya had a manufacturing base for some of the things Ugandan merchants were importing. So while Kenya wanted to protect capital goods and protect finished products which can be made in Kenya from being liberalized, Uganda wanted as low a tariff as possible on imports of goods which will be sold around. But you know, as we walked this tight road of keeping friends, but also defining what is in the national interest, Kibaki was giving us 2 directions. We must belong together and only make concessions if we can now create domestic policy to become competitive and defeat the threat that comes with those concessions. If we're liberalizing wheat, what shall we do not to kill the wheat production in Kenya? If we want to be friends with Uganda, how can we not sacrifice the people who are making some significant products that are otherwise being imported cheaply by the traders who want to lower tariffs on those finished goods? I say this because aligning actual national production interest with treaty building was a feature of leadership that has disappeared in our politics. Today is like we put saliva on the finger and we check where the direction of the wind is. Today I want that to be my friend, whether it is Kosovo or it is the rapid deployment forces. You say, how does this align with the national interest? There was no such conversation. But there's also something that I want to say that has not been properly mentioned. Mike Kibaki believed in cabinet government. The president had ideas of what he wanted done, but he was ready to modify or even suspend those ideas on the basis of discussion within the cabinet. I was impressed at how in some of the areas he knew better than most of us, but he had the humility as a leader to give every person a chance. And then when we're coming towards the end, he says, is there anybody who's opposing that position? For those of us who have not been in our cabinet, we're outraged when we hear about persons who use cabinet as a rubber stamp of personal decisions, because it never worked under Kibaki. And that way it gave us a strength to prosecute what the president was declaring in public, because we owned it as part of collective government. I had the privilege to be part of a delegation of Mike Kibaki on a state visit to Thailand. And at the state dinner, I asked the Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been one of the most successful leaders in the Eastern Asian financial crisis at the turn of the century, what he had done for Thailand to recover from the financial crisis so rapidly compared to others. And when Shinawatra said, what we did is to believe that if a tree is wilting, you don't pour water to the leaves, you pour at the stem, that you start building from the bottom, the most effective bottom-up thinking. And it struck me so much, as so similar to what Mwai Kibaki had done in Kenya. In the first few months of becoming president, he brought through cabinet an urgent resolution that would buy back KCC, the Kenya Creameries, which had been taken off by Moi and his son and a few others. And we got it back, and it immediately had an impact on the resuscitation of the dairy industry in this country. So walking the talk, believing that you align your international engagements with domestic responsibilities, and when you identify inadequacies, you deal with them. And importantly, reducing government borrowing in the domestic money markets to make credit affordable by entrepreneurs were key drivers to turning around a country which had problems similar to what we have today, but leadership was very different. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kitui.